Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everyone. While we change the slides in the front, let me say thanks to all of you. Those of us who write and do research are dependent on a vast network of support, and I want to express a public thanks to archivists, to historians, colleagues and friends, and the editors and publishers who helped me on the journey that I'm going to be speaking with you about tonight. And I want to start out by saying something you probably have never heard at the beginning of a history lecture, which is that it's okay to laugh. As the cartoon on the screen suggests, there are some laughable moments to the story that we're going to be thinking together about tonight. Some of it is going to strike you as a little bit funny, and it is from our vantage point. Tonight we're thinking back to the years 1944 to 46, the end of the Second World War and the transition to peace. And in the midst of that transition, when of course there are many pressing issues for the world to face, we're recovering a story of a rather fantastic idea, that there should be a capital of the world, a place that would be the center for diplomacy, but a place that would house the United Nations and be grander, that it might be its own identity, its own city, or at least an expansive suburb. It might be sort of like a World's Fair, or it might be like a compound of fashionable embassies. Sometimes I get the impression that people were thinking of the Emerald City from the Land of Oz as they were thinking about the capital of the world in 1945. But this is the story we're entering into. And if there were to be a capital of the world, where would it be? This was a proposition that civic boosters in American cities and towns could not resist, including Philadelphia, but also many others. No one announced a competition, least of all the United Nations, but a race began. Even before the UN officially existed, a race began to try to get the attention of the world's diplomats and to win the prize of becoming the capital of the world. It was a race of civic boosters trying to get attention for their hometowns, and it was a race of newspaper reporters who were covering the story, but in many cases often creating the story, so as to boost the campaigns for bringing the United Nations to their own localities. The race went to San Francisco, where the UN Charter was drafted. It went to London, where the UN met for the first time. It went to Mackinac Island, where the nation's governors had their conference in 1945. It went to New York, which became the base of operations for the site searching teams who would determine the outcome. It went to potential sites, especially in the Northeast and including Philadelphia. And while civic boosters were running their own race to win a prize that no one had announced, the world's diplomats were on their own parallel track, a more deliberative course of determining whether the balance of power would lie in Europe or in the United States, of trying to get an international organization off the ground, and of dealing with the very serious issues of transitioning from war to peace, all the while with the American civic boosters nipping at their heels. Now there are, I think, some serious, substantial lessons to learn from all of this. It's about the ways that local, national, and global identities are formed. It's about the ways that ideas and time and space change as communications technology changes, as transportation technology changes. But it's also a great story, as the cartoon on the screen suggests. It's full of drama and surprise and a few comic turns along the way as the boosters were racing onto the world stage, and as the world's diplomats were trying to negotiate local politics and the American real estate market. So, to begin at the beginning, I'm often asked why I became interested and how I became interested in this topic. And so this is a story from the archives. It begins in Philadelphia at a time when I was researching an entirely different subject, although I came to discover it was not entirely separate. I was working in the archives of Independence National Historical Park, going through news clippings, trying to assemble the history of Independence Hall. And I came across this clipping, Philadelphia, home of the United Nations, from the front page of the Philadelphia Record in 1945. And my only response was, What? I had lived in Philadelphia for a while, and I thought I knew something about Philadelphia's history. But this was news to me, and I wanted to find out more. Just from a little investigation, I found that Philadelphia, in addition to San Francisco, was among the earliest and most assertive and longest lasting competitors for the honor of becoming the host location for the United Nations. The inspiration was, as you can see somewhat in the clipping and can see more clearly now, Independence Hall, which was seen by Philadelphians as an inspiration to the nation and therefore presumed to be an inspiration to the world. What better reason could there be to locate the United Nations than to put it within the vicinity of the cradle of liberty? And I came to discover that this kind of attachment to local and national history was embedded in many of the competitors that came forward, offering themselves to be the capital of the world. That often they were acting from a basis of their local history, which they saw as contributing to the nation's history, which they saw then as having international significance. And it was especially true of places that had historic connections to the colonial era, to the American Revolution, and to founding fathers. So in addition to Philadelphia, into the race come Boston, Morristown, New Jersey, Saratoga, New York, Charlottesville, and Williamsburg, Virginia, just to name a few on that basis. Here we see Philadelphians on the steps of Independence Hall looking forward to their future. They are holding a map of the city, and if we could see the other side of the street, we would see an aging commercial district that had yet to become Independence National Historical Park. They are imagining that future will build from the past that they have already in place. And I love this kind of gaze up and forward, as if they're seeing the future. And this was true of other cities as well. In Detroit, that was another competitor where the boosters really saw the potential of the world capital as being a step forward from the city into the future. So this was intriguing. And I read a little bit in histories of the United Nations and got a little bit into the records of the early organization and saw some references that there were maybe 30 to 50 of these self-proclaimed world capital competitors. And that seemed enough to look a little farther. I came to understand, though, that there were many, many more. A greater variety, places in every region of the country, and not only large cities that you might expect, like Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, Denver, San Francisco, but smaller places that I never would imagine would be in a contest to become the center of the world. Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, for example, or Tuscaloosa, Oklahoma. Now, clearly I needed to find out more about this. So far as I know at this point, there were at least 248 localities that became involved in this episode to one degree or another by either making a suggestion or issuing an official invitation or embarking on a full-blown campaign to make their hometowns the capital of the world. So here I could see there would be a wide variety of materials that would allow me to see what was happening in the United States, in the society and the culture, in this transitional moment from war to peace. And it would also touch on issues that were compelling, like how we develop ideas of a place, how that is related to local identity, how that makes us feel a connection to the world. So off I was on my adventure and search for the capital of the world. Now, one of the places that I'd like to introduce into the conversation is sort of a counterpoint to the story of Philadelphia, because it is also one of the earliest and most long-lasting competitors, is the Black Hills of South Dakota. Meet Paul Bellamy. Paul Bellamy is in the driver's seat. Now, he appears in some histories of the United Nations, and he and the interest of the Black Hills are always sort of the throwaway line, right? They're the stand-in, the shorthand for expressing the ridiculous